You sit down, nothing is urgently wrong. The work is not finished, but it is not on fire. You have a few hours and nowhere specific to be. And within minutes, sometimes within seconds, it starts. The low-level hum of unease. The sense that you should be doing something. That this stillness is somehow a failure. That somewhere, in some ledger you cannot quite see, you are falling behind. This feeling has a name in psychology, though it does not yet have one clean universal label. Researchers have variously called it rest guilt, productive guilt, or leisure guilt. And it is not a personal quirk. It is not a sign of anxiety or workaholism, though it can overlap with both. It is something more fundamental, a learned response to a cultural environment that has systematically attached moral value to productivity and moral suspicion to rest. To understand where this comes from, you have to understand what psychologists call the Protestant work ethic, a concept introduced by sociologist Max Weber in the early 20th century. Weber observed that in cultures shaped by Protestant religious traditions, particularly Calvinist ones, hard work had been elevated from a practical necessity to a moral virtue. Idleness was not merely unproductive, it was sinful. The person who rested when they could be working was not just wasting time. They were failing a test of character. This framework, Weber argued, became the invisible architecture of modern Western economic life. You do not have to be Protestant to have absorbed it. You do not have to be religious at all. The values permeated the culture so deeply that they now feel like common sense rather than ideology. The belief that your worth is connected to your output, that productivity is a form of virtue, that rest must be earned. These beliefs are not facts. They are cultural inheritances. But they feel like facts because they were installed so early and reinforced so consistently. The psychological mechanism through which this becomes personal is what researchers call internalization. Over the course of childhood and adolescence, external rules about what is acceptable behavior become internal voices. The parent who praised you for being busy, the teacher who rewarded effort, the culture that celebrated achievement. These did not just shape your behavior from the outside. They shaped the inner dialogue you now carry everywhere. The voice that says you are being lazy when you're actually resting. The voice that says you have not earned this when you are sitting still. That voice is not your authentic self. It is an internalized cultural script running automatically. Psychologist Sabine Sonnentag at the University of Mannheim has studied recovery from work for decades and found something striking. The people who most need rest are often the ones least able to psychologically detach from work during rest periods. They sit on the couch, but their mind stays at the desk. The body is resting, but the brain is still processing the work, still monitoring the to-do list, still calculating what is undone. This is called rumination during rest, and it not only prevents the psychological recovery that rest is supposed to provide, it also generates a specific kind of cognitive fatigue that compounds the exhaustion rather than relieving it. What Sonnentag and her colleagues found is that the ability to psychologically detach from work during non-work time is one of the strongest predictors of long-term well-being, job performance, and resistance to burnout. People who can genuinely rest, who can be present in their non-work time without the background noise of work monitoring their leisure, consistently outperform, in the long run, people who cannot. The rest is not a break from the productive life. It is part of what makes the productive life sustainable. The guilt about rest is not only culturally produced, it also has a cognitive dimension. The Zeigarnik effect, named after psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, describes the tendency of the human brain to dwell on and remember uncompleted tasks more than completed ones. When you sit down to rest, your brain does not file away the unfinished items on your to-do list. It keeps them active in working memory, flagged as unresolved, generating low-level cognitive tension. The rest feels guilty, in part because the brain is literally maintaining an alert about things left undone. The guilt is not irrational. It is your brain's task management system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that this system was not designed for a world in which the to-do list never fully empties. There is also a social dimension to rest guilt that does not get discussed enough. In many contemporary work cultures, busyness has become a status symbol. Researcher Silvia Bellezza at Columbia Business School has studied what she calls the busyness heuristic, the cultural tendency to perceive people who appear busy and overworked as higher status, more competent, and more important than people who appear to have leisure time. In a culture where busyness signals value, rest becomes a social risk. When you rest, you become visible as someone who is not busy, which in this cultural framework can feel like becoming visible as someone who does not matter. This is the environment in which the guilt about rest is formed and maintained, not by one source, but by the convergence of inherited religious values about idleness, internalized cultural messages about productivity and worth, the brain's natural task monitoring architecture, and a social environment in which busyness has become a proxy for status. Understanding all of this does not make the guilt disappear, but it does change what the guilt means. The feeling that you should be doing something is not evidence that you should. It is evidence that you have absorbed a cultural message so thoroughly that it now feels like an internal truth. The discomfort of rest is not a signal that you are failing. It is the sensation of a learned belief encountering friction. Sonnentag's research and the broader literature on rest and recovery is unambiguous. Genuine recovery during non-work time is not a luxury. It is a biological and psychological necessity. The prefrontal cortex, which manages complex decision-making, creativity, and sustained attention, requires genuine downtime to restore its function. Sleep is one form of that restoration. But wakeful rest, leisure without guilt, time in which the brain is not performing or monitoring, is another. And that form of restoration is the one that guilt most directly undermines. The question worth sitting with is not whether you deserve to rest. That framing is itself part of the problem. The idea that rest is something that must be deserved, that it is a reward for sufficient output, rather than a requirement for continued functioning. A better question is this: what would it mean to treat rest as something you need, not something you earn? That shift from rest as reward to rest as necessity is not just semantic. It changes the relationship between the guilt and what you do with it. The guilt will probably still come. The internalized voice is not erased by understanding it, but it can be recognized for what it is. Not a signal about your character or your worth, but the sound of a cultural script that was written before you were born, running in a context it was never designed to serve. The work will be there when you come back. It always is. The question is whether you will be. Rest guilt is also gendered in ways that research has consistently documented. Studies by Shira Gabriel and colleagues at the University of Buffalo found that women, on average, report higher levels of leisure guilt than men, in part because of additional cultural messaging that connects worth with caregiving and productivity, and that frames personal rest time as time taken from others. The guilt about resting is not distributed equally across the population. It tends to fall hardest on the people who are already doing the most, which is not a coincidence, but a feature of how these cultural messages function. What all of this research points toward is not a simple instruction to rest more, though that would help most people. It points towards something more foundational, a need to examine the belief system underneath the guilt, the belief that your value as a person is connected to your output, the belief that stillness is a form of failure, the belief that rest must be justified by exhaustion so complete that no one could argue you had not earned it. These beliefs are not truths. They are stories that culture has been telling for centuries, and that most of us have been telling ourselves for as long as we can remember. The ability to rest without guilt is not a personality trait some people are born with. It is a skill, and like most skills, it gets easier with practice and harder with avoidance. Each time you rest and allow the guilt to be present without acting on it, without cutting the rest short or filling it with compensatory productivity, you are building evidence against the belief that rest is dangerous. You are teaching your nervous system, slowly, that stillness is survivable, that you are still whole when you are not producing, that the world does not fall apart when you stop.